This week I released a monster new code demo. It's a chart built with D3 and it has all sorts of bells and whistles. It's fully responsive, so it can be laid out with Flexbox and Grid. Its labels are styled with Tailwind. It even uses container queries, but the thing I'm most proud of is that it is fully server rendered. This means if I reload the page, the chart is right there alongside the rest of the HTML. I don't have to hold space until I draw it on the client. There's no layout shift or flashing, no effects, just a rock solid server rendered chart using HTML and SVG. And in this video, I want to highlight one critical piece that made it work. Here's an earlier version of the chart that uses the standard D3 techniques to render. We're using a measure hook to get the width and height of the container, which we then pass into our chart so that we can set it on the viewbox property of the SVG. And this is what lets the chart be responsive. As I change the screen size, everything scales up and down quite nicely. But useMeasure only runs in the browser. It can't run on the server. So if we were to refresh, we'll see there's a flashing white space, and then once the component is able to measure the container, the chart can render. So this made me realize I couldn't rely on useMeasure if I wanted to server render the chart. Well, it turns out this viewbox attribute doesn't actually have to correspond to the actual pixel values that are rendered on the screen. It can correspond to a fixed aspect ratio. So here we're setting the width and height, which come as arguments into our chart from our useMeasure. Let's go ahead and get rid of useMeasure. We'll get rid of this condition, and we'll remove these as arguments to our chart. And instead, since our chart is taking up a 16:9 area, let's just hard code the width to something like 1280 and the height to 720. And we can see that kind of works, but everything has shrunk down. The text is really small and the lines are really thin. And this is because we're setting a width of 1280, but the chart is only taking up about 400 pixels of space. So the stroke width and the font size are getting shrunk down. Now, if we come and find the actual chart area that contains the grid lines and our actual line and circles, there's a neat property on line and path elements that we can set. And that's called vector effect non-scaling stroke. If we save that, the actual chart area looks just like it did before. And if we were to resize this, everything works perfectly, with the exception of our labels. They're still tiny. And unfortunately, there's no corresponding attribute on SVG text nodes that will let us just scale them normally. So we could come up here and try to pick a width that's closer to the final rendered width of our chart, maybe 640 by 360. And that's going to help a bit, but it kind of defeats the purpose of making a responsive chart because these things are still going to get big with a big chart. And if we were to pull up the inspector here and show an iPhone, the text is obviously much smaller than the surrounding text. We don't really have any control over the size of the text labels independent from the rendered size of the chart. And this is where the final piece of the puzzle came in. And that puzzle piece is to use two SVG elements. One that has the viewbox attribute so that it can scale the chart area, and one that doesn't so that the text labels remain independent of the chart size. Let me show you what I mean. If we come down to our JSX, we'll see our x-axis, y-axis, and our chart area. It turns out we can go ahead and nest SVG elements. So let's wrap this entire thing inside of an SVG. And now we are going to move this viewbox attribute right down here. And check this out. The whole chart area is remaining perfectly intact. It's still responsive. And all we got to do is fix these labels because they're no longer automatically being scaled by this viewbox. So instead of putting height, we just want to put 100%. And check that out, our x-axis is back along the bottom. But it's not spaced out, right? We can see the days don't line up with the dots. And that's because the x property is still in pixels. So we can convert this to a percentage if we divide this by the width and multiply by 100. Check that out. X labels are looking pretty good and they still responsively scale. Let's go ahead and fix the y-axis and we'll do the same thing. Turn this y prop into a percentage by dividing by the height and multiplying by 100. And now check this out. We have a fully responsive chart. The actual line chart and grid lines and circles are all scaling with the container, but the labels themselves, while they remain perfectly aligned based on D3's computation, are actually remaining exactly the same pixel size no matter what size the rendered chart is. And this is so cool, not only because we're able to achieve this with this technique, but if I pull up the URL bar and refresh, we get absolutely no flash. It's completely server rendered. And one more thing I realized after I did all this work just to get my chart to be able to server render as a client component is that we don't even need to make this a client component anymore. If I delete use client and save, I'm here in an X13 app. Let's refresh. Look at that. We have a completely server rendered React server component right now. And I can prove it to you if I open up the network tab, put back use client, and take a look at how much JavaScript we are fetching. So when I render this page, we have about 2.1 megabytes of JavaScript. This is during development, but it includes everything here. If I go ahead and turn this chart into a React server component and refresh, 1.5. And that's because we're not even shipping D3 anymore. We're using D3 just for its computational methods to calculate what all of these different complicated SVG attributes should be. But at the end of the day, our chart exports pure HTML and SVG, and it works great on the initial render. It's fully responsive. We can use Tailwind to go to town with these labels, change them responsively or based on container queries, all with a single React server component that doesn't ship any JavaScript, doesn't even hydrate on the client. So that was the result of my exploration this week. I hope you liked that. Be sure to check a link in the description for the code over on Build UI. Otherwise, that's it for me. I'll see you next week.